It's time for Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
I'm not a Republican, but if I was, I would be extremely concerned about censorship in social media, which is a real thing. Censorship of Republican ideas and conservative ideas is absolutely a real thing. It's not just real, it's accepted as being the right thing to do by certain organizations. I mean, they've been caught on camera and hidden camera talking about the ways that you can silence conservative voices. For sure, conservatives are being discriminated against on social media by social media platforms. And even if you're not banning them from those platforms, if you're shadow banning them, if you're making it very difficult for people to find them, which is real. It's a real thing that they do. Like if you have a post on social media, it doesn't just go up in chronological order anymore. Now it's affected by an algorithm. They can, in certain social media platforms, use that algorithm to discriminate. So they can decide, hey, this guy keeps chirping on and on about Hillary Clinton's war crimes and all this. We don't need this guy around, okay? We don't need this guy and all of his right-wing bull and all his Make America Great Again bull. So we'll shadow ban him. And so they can shove you into this category where it's very difficult to find your page. And it's very difficult for you to show up. And a lot of people have seen their views drop drastically. There's a woman named Megan Murphy. Well, on Twitter, she wrote, "A man is never a woman." They told her she has to take down that tweet. So you know what she did? She made a screenshot of it. She took down that tweet, and then she posted a picture of the screenshot. And then they banned it for life. You know who's not banned for life? O.J. Simpson. Double homicide, armed kidnapping. He's fine. But this lady who's just said a man is never a woman, which biologically is correct.
Johnny and the Professor.
Another exciting episode of Johnny and the Professor.
Common sense for senseless times.
Where we talk politics, pop culture, and posers.
Posers. Okay.
Now, and the context, I mean posers, when I was a skate punk, there used to be like the skaters that used to have like the nice skateboards, but they didn't know how to ride them. They were called posers.
Okay, well, that means something entirely different if you're into bodybuilding, isn't it, I'd assume?
Right. And I'd flex right now, but I don't want to rip my shirt.
Yeah, well, it would knock me out of the studio here.
Have you seen The Mandalorian?
Yes, I did. I saw the first one of that.
What did you think?
I was surprised it was better than I anticipated.
Yeah.
The best way to do is go in with low expectations on everything these days, and you do better. Right. I thought it was very good. I mean, you could definitely see Favreau's influx into it, because, again, from his, from Jungle Book and from Iron Man, he's a really good director. And the story hung together well. For the fact that you never saw the faces of the main character, and yet you're trying to build a character around that's going to be interesting in the long run. And
I always thought Star Wars took a dive when they started unmasking. I mean, the only one that they unmasked was Vader, really. That's the only one they ever did, and George did it himself. You would see the back of Darth Vader, like in Empire, when he's like in his little chamber. But it wasn't until the very last movie, what we thought was the last movie, that you saw what was underneath Darth Vader, right? But then they come out with these sequels, and automatically they're unmasking clones and the stormtroopers and everybody. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I always thought that the mystique behind it always gave it, I don't know, something. But I've heard some people saying, they're trying to develop this character, and they kept the mask on the whole time, so you can't see facial expressions and this and that. But I always thought that just hiding that just kind of added that mystique and that curiosity behind it.
Well, it is the idea that when you lose some of the mystique of the character. If you see Batman on the John, then suddenly he's not suddenly this big mysterious character,
right,
avenging creature of the night. If you've caught him on the toilet with a paper in his hand,
right. So
I mean, it is the same idea. If you don't pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and that's the same idea. I'd agree with you that I think if you eventually do see the face of the character, who the Mandalorian character, and that it's probably not going to be to the very end, if at all. And you may not need it. I mean, how many movies of Darth Vader were people still terrified of Darth Vader, and you never saw his face, and they took his mask off, and my problem with Lucas in that was they chose a really doofus-looking actor for Darth Vader's face. I mean, he just looked like some kind of just I remember when I saw it at the time, it was like, who is this guy? Like the Pillsbury Doughboy? What is this?
Right.
As in, getting someone with a, you expect to look like, Vader, someone to match the voice, that went into it. But I did like it. I thought it was neat to see it has all the Star Wars feelings in it. I noticed it was interesting. They had of course, a bar, like a cantina type situation, and they were wise that they use lower light. Because that way you don't have, it just saves on your CGI budget, and it saves on your intricate costuming budget. Because again, if you've got a lizard guy in low light, I mean, the sound effect tells you he's making noise rather than to have to see his eyes move or whatever.
Right.
I give credit. It struck me that, because I mean, I don't know how much they got for the budget, but I know it's for 12 episodes, I believe. Is it 10?
8.
8?
Yeah, I thought it was 8.
Yeah, it'll be a. I think like I said, I enjoyed it. I mean, I'd be interested to see the rest of it, though I don't know. I saw it with a friend, so I don't know if I want to subscribe to Disney just to watch it.
Right.
So.
Right. Bob Iger said that there was too much too soon when Solo bombed, and he thought there was too much Star Wars too soon. He oversaturated. They're gonna halt all Star Wars and just give a little bit at a time so people don't get burnt out. I don't think that's. I just don't think that's the case. I think if it's good. Favreau wrote this, Mandalorian, and some people are critiquing it, like over critiquing. It's like, what do you want? It's a 30-minute, it's a 30-minute little series here. Go ahead.
I disagree. I agree with you on the idea that it's too much Star Wars if it's the same Star Wars we've been getting for the last few years.
If it's poor quality.
There's only so much crap you can deal with. Eventually, that it doesn't have to be filet mignon. If you just give me a decent hamburger, I'd be happy in Star Wars.
Right.
Because what you've been giving me is tofu. Ick. I mean, literally, because it's the whole political correctness, vegan, Star Wars. Basically, no one has any abilities unless, of course, you're a woman in the series, and if you're a man, you walk around going, "Why am I here?"
Right.
I mean, I'm assuming the Mandalorian character is a male because the voice sounds male. Interesting, though, he went to see the blacksmith who made him a pauldron, and the smith was obviously a female.
Right. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Well, and it shouldn't be. I mean, again, because the only generally difference men would be blacksmiths is because blacksmithing requires a level of strength that most women can't keep and maintain.
Oh, you're such a toxic male saying
true,
that.
Though. I'm sorry. Women are about 50% weaker than men are. That's just physical.
How dare you?
I can't argue with biology. I'm sorry.
How dare you say that?
But interestingly enough, on the other hand, the blacksmith she had all high-tech stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it really wasn't like it took a lot of time. I've actually pounded iron and made armor, and it is hard work.
Mm-hmm. I
mean, when I used to be involved in the Society for Creative Anachronism. But, so I have great respect for actual blacksmithing. But it was I thought it was an interesting twist, and that the idea that the whole Mandalorian is almost like a knight of its own version. It's honoring its clan. I mean, I don't really know that much about the Mandalorian. I've read some of the Star Wars fiction on it, but I don't know how much that Favreau is going to adapt.
Right. So it should be interesting to see what direction it goes now.
Well, I have another bit of pop culture information that I came across that I thought was interesting because it kind of related to me in an indirect way. There's a British singer named Ellie Goulding.
Mm-hmm.
You ever heard of her?
We play her on the jet.
Okay. Well, she is she was doing volunteer work with the Salvation Army. It's part of a Red Kettle thing that is done with the Dallas Cowboys. They're going to be playing the Buffalo Bills, and they have a big kettle drive thing for the Salvation Army. And they had footage of her working in one of the Salvation Army kitchens, and she. The Dallas Cowboys were going to pull out of it because people started complaining because the Salvation Army is not tolerant of LGBT people.
Of course, people complained.
And the insanity about it, of course, is the Salvation Army. I used to work for the Salvation Army. Getting out my here. I worked locally here and did the the internet sales for it. I was an e-commerce person, and I sold things, collectible things online for the store and made money for them. And the Salvation Army. I mean, I'm not a Christian fellow, but it doesn't change the fact 80% of their money goes directly into helping people. They are a real live charity. There are a lot of charities that act like they're charities, but when you look at their money, they give 20-30% of their money to charity.
And the rest goes to the executive directors or
whatever.
Something,
and I mean, and there's some ones that are big ones like UNICEF, that when you check UNICEF, only about 25% of their money actually goes out. Other ones are like that too. The Salvation Army and the Red Cross are the only real deal charities that I know of. But this was ridiculous. They give money and support and help to everybody, but again, they're a Christian organization, and therefore Christians are going. Christianity is generally somewhat restrictive on the idea of homosexuality. A big surprise, but I was glad that the Cowboys stood up and decided to act like cowboys, and decided they would actually go ahead and have her in the halftime show, and everything would be fine for starting out the Red Kettle Drive, because they've been doing it for like 25 years or something. I thought it was a good case because political correctness actually seemed to finally lose that battle, and maybe this is a good thing.
Whatever happened to just respecting people for their beliefs, whether they aligned with yours or not?
Well, and again, you can, if you want to argue on whether or not about LGB people, I tend to only throw those letters out personally. I go LGB. I'll go with lesbian. I'll go with gay, and I go with bisexual. After that, I don't do the rest of the alphabet soup on that, because you're getting too close to arguments on whether you're talking about lifestyle choices or you're talking about dysphoria and things like that. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into all this other category, but I don't really care what people do. Adults have a right to make whatever choices they want.
Right.
And, like I said, as long as you're not impinging on my rights, do what you want. Right. But when you start complaining to me because I don't agree with that, I'm not willing to talk about the idea that I believe that men and women are actually biologically different. I'm sorry, that's scientific fact. I've taken biology classes. I grew up, when I was young for a few years on a farm, and I've seen bulls and cows, and they're different. Okay, mammals have males and females. That's just the way it is. Now, if I say that and you say, okay, well, we're going to boycott you, destroy your world, burn down your house, okay, now you're violating my rights, okay? Just because and my opinion isn't even an opinion. My opinion is a fact. Now, whether or not people have a right to choose to be in certain ways, that's their choice. They're adults. As long as they're not hurting other people, I don't care.
What about indoctrinating kids? Well,
that's, we talked about that with Zuby when we had him on last week. That's child abuse. Children you cannot, I'm sorry, if a child is 5 years old, if you're wanting 5-year-olds to choose their sexuality, it's because you probably are a wannabe child molester, is all I can see, because you're wanting kids to be able to be sexual beings at that age. I mean, that is ridiculous. It's abuse. Children think they're bunny rabbits. They think they're cats and dogs. They think they're unicorns and fairies. They can be their world is still made of almost pure imagination. A person whose world is made of imagination does not have the ability to discern whether they're actually a male or a female at that point. And a parent who gives them hormone blocking things, I'm sorry, that child needs to be with someone who actually cares for it and loves it, not someone who's trying to make it into. If you wanted a girl instead of a boy, maybe you should have adopted instead of having a kid.
Right. How dare you say that, you toxic male?
Well, my opinion to people who want to do that is to their children. It's two words, and the first one starts with F, and then the second one is U. That's the end of my argument with Anonymous. It's ridiculous. I have no tolerance for people who abuse children, and that's abuse of children.
Indeed. Well, let's see. I don't remember. Are we in the first? Are we pretending we're in the first or the second segment?
We can do it however you want. Let's do this as the first part, and I'll talk a little. I can talk a little about our guest then. So, let me pull up my Andrew Klavan info. So, okay.
So, who's our guest today?
Well, in our second segment today, we're going to have on Andrew Klavan. Andrew Klavan has the Andrew Klavan Show, which is a podcast on the Daily Wire, which is, of course, a large internet news talk organization that Ben Shapiro's involved in, and Michael Knowles and other ones like that. And I do watch a lot of their stuff. Klavan is I find him quite interesting. He's a novelist. He's written several crime novels. True Crime, which was a movie, that book was made into a movie by Clint Eastwood, and Don't Say a Word, which was made a movie by Michael Douglas was in. He also writes, is a screenwriter. He's very successful in his career is that way. Matter of fact, he wrote a screenplay for a movie called A Shock to the System with Michael Caine. This is back in like 1980. But it's a great movie. Most people, if anybody's ever seen it, I'd recommend it. It was one of the ones I really liked. The most recent thing he did was it was a movie that came out that was called Gosnell, which was the trial of America's biggest serial killer. And Gosnell was, of course, the abortion doctor that is responsible apparently for aborting unnecessarily about 200 to 300 babies in his career. And that movie had Dean Cain in it, and that was from, I think, was in last year or the end of the year before. And he also wrote the screenplay for that. And so we'll be having him on today to talk about politics and probably good old-fashioned, Donald Trump, because the center of all politics in the United States these days seems to be Donald Trump.
The racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe?
Yeah, well, apparently the unsuccessful one, because he's not, as far as I can tell, he's not homophobic, he's not really racist, and he doesn't really seem to be terribly sexist. I mean, he's hired more women in his companies than any liberal I know.
How could that be, though?
Well, because again, there's the real Trump, and then there's the Trump of imagination that the media puts out, because they want to destroy him because he's a danger to the left's power base. Isn't it weird that Donald Trump? Who would have thought the emissary of the fall of the left could be Donald Trump? Really?
Right.
You're fired.
I don't think we're ever going to get a non-career politician in the White House ever again, just because of what the left has done and is doing, the bias, the whole ball of wax. I don't think the deep state will ever let this happen again, whether they have to cheat or whatever.
Well, I mean, we're seeing that in the media in a lot of ways. Isn't Facebook's not allowing any political ads at all, right?
Something like that.
So,
yeah.
Because that way to make sure Donald Trump and conservatives can't put forth ads.
Right.
I mean, the media is constantly against anything that Trump has to say, whether it's good or bad or indifferent.
Did you see where he wanted to give in and meet them halfway and negotiate and make a deal? Okay, we're going to let you have your illegal aliens and in your sanctuary cities. Okay, let's bring them on in. And everybody, all the Democrats and the left, wait a minute. No, you can't do that. You can't just dump them. You're trying to dump them. You're trying to dump them in American cities. You can't do that when that's what they were wanting in the first place.
And the weird part about that is
it gets weirder.
It does get weirder, actually. In February, when this was a big issue, when it finally got to the peak about illegal immigration, illegal immigrants crossing across the border was at 144,000 during the month of February. You know what it was last month? 43,000. I mean, it's still a lot, but I mean, literally in that period of time, Trump, with the Democrats fighting him tooth and nail, doing everything that they've done, he still has taken it down from 143,000 to it's dropped by 100,000 illegals per month.
Because he's a racist and doesn't want them here.
But he's not doing it with anything other than making deals with Mexico.
Right.
So the Mexico must be the racist. Mexico must be racist against other Mexicans coming into the United States, because they're the ones who are actually stopping it.
How come there's no problem up north in Canada, the Canadian border? How come there's not a problem like this there?
There is some problem with that. People don't talk about it. It doesn't come in large amount, but the Canadian border is probably a much easier place if I were a terrorist to sneak into the United States than the Mexican border. Mm-hmm. But I think the difference is that, Canada has a small amount of people. Less people are allowed to come in. You're not allowed. People talk about Canada like it's this wonderland of goodness.
Right.
You and I can't go live in Canada because Canada won't take us.
Yeah, they won't.
You can visit, but you can't stay because we'd have to bring something to Canada. They do immigration based on merit, unless, of course, Trudeau wants to make political points, and then he allows people to pour in from an area somewhere in the world so he can prove what an understanding human being he is.
Right.
If you ever, anybody who thinks Donald Trump's bad, you could always be worse. You can always have Trudeau as your president.
Oh, but they have free health care.
Yeah, they also have less people. They have about the same amount of people that Washington has, actually. Washington and Idaho, I think, have as many people as Canada.
Right. And then also they're taxed high a lot. It's my understanding.
Oh, it is. And like most situations, they want to talk about their socialist ideas, but they have high taxes. But then Canada would never consider itself a socialist government. It would consider itself capitalist because it has to make money.
Right.
There's not a country in the world other than that is a successful country that calls itself a socialist nation. People talk about, the Scandinavian nations, none of them say they're socialists. All of them will tell you they're capitalists.
Right.
They just but they also have homogenous peoples and small amount of them.
And why is that they're talking about these countries that are mostly white?
It is something about that too. I mean, I guess that's that's the ultimate incarnation of white privilege, I guess, right?
I don't know.
It is silly that people don't look at it in the reality of the fact that socialism doesn't work, guys. I mean, it works until you run out of spending other people's money, and it's only designed to socialism is designed to go into communism, which is totalitarian government. So where are you guys going? I mean, why don't you just fess up and admit you want to rule and dominate all the people of the United States because you have this wonderful idea of how it's supposed to be run. Well, you and Adolf Hitler had the same kind of idea.
I think more people need to look up the 45 communist goals as read into the congressional record in 1963, and I think that would reveal a lot.
It's a good point. Excellent one. Very good, Johnny. That one's a very good point for people you're talking about. That again, back in the days when they were dealing with a real live Cold War, because the Russians were were actually the red menace that they aren't anymore today, because they still have their nukes, but not the technology to lock them, and they have an economic power about comparable to Italy. So I mean, so they're not really a.
Everything in those 45 goals have been achieved, if not just about.
We're pretty close.
Right.
Well, again, they changed it. They changed it from bourgeoisie and proletariat to the rich and all of the discriminated individual identity politic groups that have to war for position.
Oh, that's just your male white privilege talking now.
Is that my white privilege like Norway's white privilege, or is that my white privilege like an American white privilege? I don't know which is the choice.
Norway, Sweden, Finland, Canada.
Yeah, predominantly all one color too, I've noticed. Yeah, isn't that strange? That people, but yet no one seems to want to yell about that.
It's Johnny and the Professor coming up from the Daily Wire. Andrew Klavan.
This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
You said to the President of the United States, "What do you want from Ukraine?" The President, "I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I want Zelensky to do the right thing. I want him to do what he ran on." Why didn't you put that statement in your opening statement? I think you said you couldn't fit it in. Is that right? Said we might be here for 46 minutes instead of 45 minutes.
It wasn't purposeful. Trust me.
Wasn't purposeful?
No.
Couldn't fit it in a 23-page opener.
You really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations.
Other than my own presumption.
Which is nothing.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com. This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
You really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations.
Other than my own presumption.
Now we know that every fantasy about how corrupt this administration was is actually true.
Other than my own presumption.
Our live coverage of the blowtorch testimony this morning.
Other than my own presumption.
From Gordon Kevin Sondland turns out to be the guy who has offered the most stunning testimony.
Other than my own presumption.
In addition to that, in the bombshells we've heard about, this was an IED from Mr. Sondland.
Other than my own presumption.
As you said, taking a blowtorch to every defense Donald Trump has offered.
Other than my own presumption.
We don't say this very often anymore because it's rarely true, but I think today changed everything.
Other than my own presumption.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.
Well, it's Johnny and the Professor, where we talk politics, pop culture, and posers. Hey, such a poser, man.
Our guest today is not a poser by any means. He's the real deal, because our guest today is Andrew Klavan, who most of you would know probably from the Daily Wire. So, greetings, Mr. Klavan.
It's nice to be here. Thanks.
I know you, from watching your podcast, I know you don't like talking about it, but we're going to torture you a little anyway, and thought we might talk about the impeachment process going on right now.
Yeah, you know, I don't like talking about it for the same reason I don't like talking about some of the crazier assertions of the left, like when they say things like men menstruate or, you know, truth is a white supremacist construct or something like that. I think when somebody says something that absurd, you only dignify it by discussing it, even when you argue with it, even when you debunk it. And I think this impeachment thing is absurd. Listen, I have never been 100% in the Trump tank. You know, I've talked about my problems with him. It has nothing to do with any of that. But these are guys who have literally been talking about impeaching this president since before he was even elected. They were talking about we need an insurance policy against him. They started an investigation into him on charges that were utterly absurd, this Russian collusion thing, which was just utterly ridiculous, a completely empty charge. They cluttered our news stations with news of this, and remember the walls were closing in, and it was the beginning of the end, and this is the tipping point, and it's all over for Donald Trump. And then when that blew up in their faces, they just moved on to the next thing. It was suddenly, oh, well, he obstructed justice. Well, how did he obstruct justice? He obstructed justice by shouting down the hall, you know, this stinks, I'm being hoaxed to death, which was absolutely true. So then they went with that, and people wouldn't go for that. They brought out Stormy Daniels, and people didn't care about that. It's just one thing after another. I really expect them, you know, to impeach him for using an apostrophe in its, you know, when he doesn't mean that kind of its. You know, it's just they will come up with anything. So now they've come up with this absurd Ukraine thing where he asked them to investigate what is perfectly worthy of investigation, the corruption in the Ukraine, and whether it had to do with anything that happened during the 2016 election, and whether it had anything to do with the Obama administration's obvious carelessness, at least, in having Hunter Biden occupy a position he had no business holding. So if you want to make the case that this is some horrific thing that threatens our constitutional way of life, take it to the voters. No president has ever been impeached in his first term. For the simple reason is if you don't like a guy in his first term, take it to the voters. Go to the voters, go up in the hustings and say, this is what happened in Ukraine, vote for me. But instead, they've got this absolute show trial with Adam Schiff. I mean, I expect Adam Schiff to show up wearing one of those paper king hats you get at Burger King. He won't let anybody talk. He won't let anybody present contrary evidence. He won't let people bring up points of order. And so when you discuss this thing, and when I see Democrats and never-Trumpers on TV kind of scratching their chins thoughtfully and parsing whether this piece of evidence was important, to me, it really is as if they're discussing whether men menstruate or not. They are dignifying what is obviously a complete political show trial, a campaign program bought and paid for by the public purse. They're taking it seriously, and I just don't like to do it.
It seems like they're just like the Democrats are just stalling so they don't have to compromise with President Trump or do anything.
What have they done? What law have they passed? What problem have they addressed? You know, they take our money. The only time I ever hear them vote is when they're raising the debt ceiling so they can pay themselves. What on earth do they do? You know, I mean, it's just amazing. And to be honest with you, I have this beef with the right as well. I think this is a Republican thing as well. You know, if they were so appalled by what was happening at the border, why haven't they come up with a way of, you know, basically reforming the laws so they don't entice people to charge the border the way they've been doing. I mean, look, you don't get everything you want. You can't satisfy your base. So your base on both sides is going to be too extreme. You have to sit down with one another. You have to make compromises. You get a little bit of what you want, and you give a little bit. That's called governing. You know, what they're doing now is just absolutely TV, and it has nothing to do with anything. And I mean, I would like, when they go before, if they weren't debating in front of partisans, because they only debate with left-wing Democrat-leaning journalists, people would say, what have you done? What have you accomplished? What has Bernie Sanders ever accomplished besides renaming a post office? You know, what have these guys ever done that helped the American people? And really, the answer is Zippo. You know? I just think the fact that they don't want us to focus on that and what a bunch of losers their candidates are.
It's also a very strange idea. I've always thought that I wonder what Donald Trump would have been able to accomplish as a president if he actually had people that were working with him.
The reason that's such an important question is because Trump is the opposite of an extremist. They keep saying he's Hitler, he's an authoritarian. And first of all, if he were Hitler, you wouldn't be able to say he was Hitler because he'd be Hitler. You know?
Yeah, the brown shirts show up at the house. Yeah, I know.
Exactly, but nothing happens. But you know, the other thing about him is he's always been willing to make a deal. If they had put in front of him any kind of compromise immigration bill, he'd have signed it. If they'd have put in front of him a compromise tax bill, he'd have signed that. He's very, very amenable to negotiation. He believes in it. It's a whole story of his life. And yet, they hate him so much. They hate him so much that they can't even do that. It really is an embarrassment, and it's also a testimony to how broken our government is. You know, one of the things I keep hearing that just really makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up on end at these impeachment hearings, these bureaucrats and ambassadors keep coming forward and talking about Trump violating the interagency consensus. Now, bring me my copy of the Constitution, and you show me where our foreign policy is set by an interagency consensus. It's set by the President of the United States, and if the interagency consensus doesn't agree, the interagency consensus has to go. And this sense that these agencies, this deep state, as they call it, has become so powerful that even the suggestion that the President can overrule them sends them into fits is embarrassing and disgraceful. And the fact that the press is backing it up, the fact that the New York Times, a former newspaper, is running stories saying how wonderful it is that the deep state is protecting our Constitution. And again, my question is, if the deep state is protecting our Constitution, where is the deep state mentioned in the Constitution, and how constitutionally do we get them to stop? Because they're completely out of control and they're completely lawless. And Trump is actually, I didn't start out a Trump fan. I am now, simply because he's the only thing standing between me and this really bizarre way of looking at our government.
I did not support his candidacy once Trump was elected. He's my president. I supported Barack Obama. I didn't agree with his policies, but I supported his presidency. Is it more of a fear situation because Trump is actually a threat to the deep state?
I think he is a threat to the deep state. He's also a threat to the encroaching political correctness that has strangled both our political discourse, but also our mental freedom. I think that we have gotten into a state where we're even afraid to say certain things. Just now, I was reading that Chick-fil-A has kowtowed to the gay lobby and basically said it will stop giving money to Christian charities that the gay lobby doesn't like. And my feeling is hey, I'm a supporter of gay people, but I don't want Chick-fil-A not to give their money to the charity of their choice. The thing about Trump is that he doesn't speak the way they tell him to speak. He doesn't pay tribute to the politically correct niceties. And just in doing that, I think he has broken some of the mental chains that the left has slowly been wrapping around us for the last 3 decades. And I think that that's what has them hysterical. That's why they keep taking everything he says out of context. He comes out and he says there are good people on both sides of the statue debate, and they make it sound as if he was saying there were good people between the Nazis and the Antifa,
Right.
And that's just lying. And it's they're doing it for a reason, because he's not paying due attention to the way they want us to talk and they want us to think. And the fact that he has taken on the press, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the best thing he's done. Our press is now corrupt. Our press is now a corrupt corporate spokesperson for the Democrat Party and for bigger government, because big business loves big government. And I think our press needs to be totally reformed. And because we have a First Amendment, which I support with all my heart, it can't be reformed by force. It can't be reformed by fiat. It has to be reformed by shame and by competition. And Trump has really brought that to the fore. And that's really the best. That is the triumph of his presidency so far.
Mr. Klavan, are that many American voters that naive or stupid to believe what the left is telling everybody?
There may be enough, because sometimes I ask myself, if trust in the news media is as low as it's ever been, why doesn't the news media change? And I think the answer to that question is that if they can convince 2, 3, 4, 5% of the people that Chuck Todd is actually an honest broker of information, which is hilarious. I mean, a hilariously comic notion. If they can convince just a few people, right, then they've tilted the scale a little bit in their favor. And so it's just one front of the war they're fighting. And I don't know if there are enough people who think to themselves, as I frequently do, if you're lying to me, then I'm going to go in the other direction. You know, if I look at Chuck Todd and Stephen Colbert and, George Stephanopoulos, and they're all telling me the same thing, I'm going to just start thinking, wait a minute, there's got to be two sides to every story. Why aren't I hearing the other side? And one of the reasons I think this Jeffrey Epstein story is such a big story, and not just Jeffrey Epstein, but the entire kind of Me Too sexual malfeasance story that's come out, is that when you look at it, the press is deeply, deeply involved in this thing. You know, they were making fun of Prince Andrew for going to Jeffrey Epstein's party, but George Stephanopoulos was also at that party. And when ABC, where George Stephanopoulos works, got the story on Jeffrey Epstein during the Hillary Clinton election, they killed it, probably because it involved Bill Clinton. That's just a vast network of corruption that I think you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see. It's kind of right out there in the open. And I think when you see that, you do start to wonder, will there come a point when somebody puts this together and says, no, here's the story, we're going to tell this story, and when the public says, oh, I get it, these guys are bad guys.
That's one of the issues I think is going right now with the Inspector General report coming out, and also when we're dealing with the situation of other investigations along this line. Is there going to come a point, hopefully, that the American people are going to realize that these people involved in this are corrupt individuals. They are trying to take away your freedom, and they're trying to take away your money. And some of the questions, again, I think actually one that you've actually said on your show, that people often talk of what it's going to cost us financially, but the bigger question is, what's it going to cost you as a matter of your freedoms and your liberties? Well,
you bring up an excellent point, which is what I think this impeachment is all about. I think this impeachment is a lot of noise and drum beating and can rattling, basically, to drown out the sound of this slow unearthing of information about the Obama administration. I mean, one of the montages I love to play on my show is every single newsman in America at the end of the Obama administration saying this administration was scandal-free. Well, this administration, the Obama administration, was rotten to the core. He used the IRS to shut down voters, to shut down the Tea Party. He used the State Department to spread lies about Benghazi. And now it really seems as if he may have used the intelligence and investigative branches of government to stop Donald Trump, to spy on Donald Trump. And that's the story, I think, that everybody's trying to bury. It's an amazing thing that all these news institutions, the New York Times, NBC, ABC, CBS, and they have no curiosity about that, no curiosity about whether the President of the United States used the FBI to infiltrate an opposition campaign. So basically the narrative that they're selling us is that Obama spying on Donald Trump, tapping his phones, sending agents into his campaign, that was fine. But Trump on the phone, and Trump's a big mouth, Trump on the phone saying, maybe you ought to investigate Joe Biden in Ukraine, that's an impeachable offense. And so it's just, it is so absurd. And when you ask me the question, will people be fooled? I sometimes worry that it's so absurd that people can't believe how absurd it is. That they think like, well, they wouldn't be covering this if it were just a great big joke. But it is. It's a great big joke, and it's a great big cover-up of the 8 years of Obama's failed presidency. He failed in the Middle East. He failed with the economy. And he failed to basically keep the institutions of government in check. And now they're blaming all this on Donald Trump as if he did these things, and he hasn't. When has Donald Trump ever done anything to threaten anybody's freedom? When has he ever done anything to threaten anybody's right to free speech or his right to vote? And yet they talk about him as if he were an authoritarian, where we really just ended an authoritarian administration, the Obama administration, plus an authoritarian idea of government in this idea of interagency consensus that's supposed to rule over us.
It's a terrifying idea that you're having people that have no election accountability whatsoever, and yet they're supposed to be making policies and determining our lives. But of course, the media and those people are going to not want this situation with Obama to be revealed because they're collaborators, they're enablers.
That's right. You read all these stories, anonymous sources within the intelligence community, and you just stop and think for a minute. If I don't know who that guy is, how do I know what his agenda is? Because every source has an agenda. Nobody leaks to the press for fun. They leak to get something accomplished. So if you tell me over and over again that this is an anonymous source in the intelligence community, and then when it comes out that this is a guy who hates Donald Trump, you write stories in the New York Times saying, isn't it wonderful that our brave men and women in the intelligence community are standing up against this president to defend the Constitution? I think, I'm in Alice in Wonderland. I mean, this is down too far down the rabbit hole for me. I mean, I really do believe in the structures of our government. I really do believe in the separation of power, the enumerated powers of the Constitution, and this idea that these unelected guys can leak to the press, and the press will therefore regard them as the true government, is just frightening to me.
There is a long-term idea from the left to become a more autocratic government and keep people in their place and live the world they want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing. I have this fictional podcast, Another Kingdom, which is a fantasy suspense story.
I've been listening to some of it.
There's a crazy girl, a girl who's like a little bit nuts, and she knows the truth, but she can never quite put it in real terms because she's a little crazy. And sometimes I look at these conspiracy theorists, and I think that that's what they're like. You hear about QAnon, and they're talking about this network of child, prostitution going on, and you listen to them, and it's crazy. And it is crazy, but it's kind of a crazy version of the truth. I mean, we have these people with all this power, unaccounted for power, who, were passing little girls around. You have these people who are collaborating with the CIA and the intelligence community to tell lies about the president and put them out in the paper, and then they tell you that it's a good thing that they're doing this. And you think it is like the conspiracy theorists are crazy, but it's a crazy version of something that's actually happening, because it's not as if they all gathered together in a room like in a James Bond movie where they sit at the long table with, the bad guy and discuss their various projects. It's not like that. It is simply that their interests conjoin in this network of abuse and of power that has gotten out of control. And I think Trump is actually a threat to it, maybe more than he means to be, for all I know, but he obviously is.
Well, he's had the advantage of somewhat of being an insider himself, having had all these people come before him and bow down and go, please give me money. I mean, he knows what he's dealing with.
I think that's true. I think there are times he must sit around and just laugh and say, oh yeah, this guy talking about what an evil guy I am. I remember when he came to my hotel and, asked for a $2 million donation. I think there must be an element of comedy to it to him. He does seem, I was a little worried that he checked into the hospital the other day, but he does seem to be kind of thriving on this. He seems to have a good time in the fight. So hopefully he'll be able to stand up to them. Because really, he has become, I've gone from really disliking him to feeling like, he's a big character with big flaws, but at least he stands for the freedom of the country. I kind of think the evangelicals got him right. They looked at him and they said, well, he's not a man of God, but he may be an instrument of God.
And it might have been you who said it, that supporters of Trump take him seriously but not literally, and enemies of Trump take him literally but not seriously.
I'm not the one who said that, but I think there is a lot of truth to that. After a while with Trump, you do say, oh yeah, he does mouth off, he does exaggerate, but he doesn't really lie about anything serious. It is interesting. I'm not going to tell you he always tells the truth, but he doesn't tell you that if you like your health care, you're going to keep your health care. He doesn't tell you that Iran is going to do great. If we just give them a little deal, that'll be fine.
Palletfuls of cash. I mean, we're worried about Trump talking to a Ukrainian president, and nobody seems to care about the $3.5 billion of cash that was dropped off in Iran.
I know we're supposed to sit and weep because the ambassador of Ukraine lost her job, but the ambassador's in Benghazi lost his life. So it is amazing. Yeah.
And also forgetting that when Barack Obama came into office, he suspended all ambassadors and reappointed those he wanted. Which is what most presidents do, and I think that's what they're really afraid of. If Donald Trump is reelected, and I'm beginning to think it's likely, barring a cataclysm, that he's going to end up, I think he's going to go through like the Grim Reaper, and probably a lot of these people in the deep state are going to have to be looking for new jobs.
Yeah, I think he was too naive to do it the first time. He should have done it the first time.
The weird part about Trump is that since he's not a politician, he's willing to give people a chance. And when they screw him over, then he fires them.
Yeah, I don't think he understood how bad it was. I think a lot of when he was campaigning, he was mouthing off about draining the swamp. I don't think he realized what a swamp it is. Right. It really has gotten. This really is bad. And the thing is, the fact that the press sits there with a straight face and reports this as the news. The other day, Chris Wallace listened to Marie Yovanovitch and said, you'd have to have a heart. You don't have a pulse if you weren't moved by that. And I thought, who cares if you're moved? They're trying to throw out an election. Who cares if you're moved? It's not a TV show. It's not a drama. It's actually a political power play. Let's treat it that way.
Would you like to tell about some of the projects you're working on?
Another Kingdom has been a great joy to me. I wrote it started as a novel and then decided to put it out as a podcast. It has 3 seasons. It's in its third and final season, and it's also coming out as a novel, so you can get the novel or the audiobook at Amazon. And recently I did something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and I don't know if it'll work, but I thought I'd try it. I took a bunch of my speeches that I made this year and a long article I made, and they really kind of put together my vision of how I think we have to speak, faith and freedom back into the culture. Because I think it is a problem. So much of what we're dealing with is not a political problem, it's a cultural problem. It's a problem of losing our values, it's a problem of losing the chain of logic that led us to be free in the first place. And so I put out a book called The Art of Making Sense, and it's really just a pamphlet. I priced it as cheaply as I possibly could. It's on Amazon. Like I said, it's called The Art of Making Sense. And it's just a collection of my writings, my nonfiction writings from this year. So those are the things I've been doing, and I'm looking forward to the new year to do some new projects. But right now, Another Kingdom and this new pamphlet are kind of the things I've been working hardest on. And because I really feel we're in 2 battles, we're not in one. We're really in a cultural battle as well as a political battle. And I think the right, specifically, conservatives specifically, are tremendously bad with the culture. The left really knows how to tell a story. The left knows how to dominate industries like Hollywood and the Academy and the news business where stories are told. And we sit there and we try to fight to win, some congressional district in Ohio. And we pour all our money into this congressional district in Ohio. And we say, hooray, we won this congressional district in Ohio. And meanwhile, the left is using the culture to eat away at the foundations of what we believe in our system. So I'm in a culture fight, and I think I'm in a fight to enlist conservatives into the culture, to tell them you got to make movies, you got to make television shows, you got to write novels, you got to talk about the things that matter to people, because most people are not worried about tariffs. Most people are worried about meaning and having a life that matters. People are killing themselves by the bushel, and I think that is a result of a life that we've been sold, that is a life without meaning, a life that's all about money, a life that's all about equality instead of about freedom. And I just think we have to fight that fight in the culture. And, I can't do it by myself. So I'm just kind of arguing to try and get the right to participate.
This has been Johnny and the Professor. Politics.
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
Pop culture.
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
Common sense in senseless times.